Okay, people, we're all here, I think. There might be a few stragglers that come in. And while we're gathering, we'll just say welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming. As you know, this is part of an island-wide community meeting to get out the latest on what's happening on our island that deals with large industrial operations. Corporations that come in from elsewhere use our island and oftentimes leave quite a bit of pollution behind. I don't know if Gary Hooser is going to be able to make it tonight. He was trying. He's here. Gary, you're here? All right, there he is. Gary Hooser. He's so busy, it's hard to know when he can make it. But Gary's here to join us. He'll give an update on the cases on the west side and some good news there. I'll cover what's happening with our fight with the dairy. And I should say, I don't know if it's considered a fight, but basically our effort to persuade them that that's not a great location and fraught with problems, based on all the science and the study that's been done by a lot of good people. So I'll update you on that. And Carl Berg was Surfrider. You're here for Surfrider. Yeah. They've really done a lot to keep our water safe for us and at least make us aware when it isn't safe, and that's really important. So Surfrider's here, and then last but not least, we have our guest speaker from Portland, Oregon, Paul Cienfuegos, who will acquaint you with community rights ordinances that have been passed in 200 communities throughout the U.S. and what that has done and how that has helped communities like ours to avoid being injured and have their environment permanently harmed. So everybody help yourself. Thank you. There's food, drink, and make yourselves comfortable. My name is Bridget Hammerquist, and I've been serving as the president of Friends of Maholepu. As many of you know, we're a grassroots community-based organization. We formed when the dairy announced they were coming to study and kind of get a feel for what they were proposing and what this meant for us. 700 pregnant cows is now their proposed startup herd, producing 100,000 pounds of wet manure a day and urine in addition to that. And those waste products, when measured and evaluated by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, they've described it as the equivalent of a city of 115,000 people. So that means 115,000 people leaving their waste every day in Maholepu Valley, untreated, on the ground. That's what the dairy project really is. And yes, it's to produce milk, but our total objection has always been not at that location because it's just too fraught with problems. It doesn't make sense. We've got a beautiful coastline. We've got a beach that's 0.8 of a mile downslope. One of our favorite pictures is up here before you, and you can see Maholepu. We love Kauai, and we certainly all love Maholepu. I don't think there's anybody that's ever been there that didn't fall in love with it. I brought some materials tonight that you're welcome to help yourself to. We have free bumper stickers. We have a fact sheet. We have a key contact sheet up here, single sheets. The key contact sheets list all of the government officials and their addresses and their email addresses. Please take one. We need the community's help. We need everybody to weigh in on this. People approach us all the time and say, well, they're not really doing it, right? They've changed their mind, right? They're going someplace else. And I have to say, no, they're still very much intent on doing it. In a recent article in the Garden Island, Amy Hennessy was quoted as saying, we wouldn't do anything to harm the environment. And I said to my husband, 2 years of outrageous pollution in the waters coming from the farm site and in the Waiopili stream on Gillen's Beach. How can you even contemplate adding more waste, more bacteria-laden waste, and think you're not going to harm the environment? There is an excerpt from the EPA article that talks about the waste load. It says 2,000 cows. Actually, it gives 2,500 cows and said that's the equivalent of a city of 411,000 people. The waste that they put out per day is equivalent to 411,000 people. And at 700 cows or 699, their startup herd, it's 115,000. That figure's actually in there. So you can pick up one of those. There's a document up here that was put out by the Virginia Tech Institute, and it reports the various zoonotic diseases that a community is exposed to when large-scale industrial farms arrive near residential communities. The obvious, of course, is that real estate values plummet. We also have a report from an agricultural engineer. It's very well done, and he took the Natural Resource Conservation Services report. He actually found it on the World Wide Web. It was done for the dairy site itself, and it is entitled A Custom Soil Resource Report for the island of Kauai. And the picture on the first page of the report is the dairy's property. When the NRCS study was done, they divided the property into 51 sectors, and they described 33 of the 51 as being at high or very high risk for runoff. And that's our biggest concern. The runoff is to where? The Waiopili Stream, the ditches. The farm site has many ditches. And then we have our drinking water wells. Many of us didn't even realize our wells were so close to this site until someone suggested they thought there were drinking water wells in Mahalapu, and we contacted the Department of Water, Kauai Water Department, who didn't know about the dairy at all at that point because the dairy wasn't planning on using county water, so they hadn't contacted the county. And the county was quite concerned and asked for an electronic copy of the dairy plan that's on file with the state. And they told us they identified 2 wells that were not on the dairy plan that do exist right near there, and 2 other wells that the dairy identified, which they described in print as more than a half mile from the dairy site, but it's not. It's actually 700 and 750 feet away. And we've since learned that right next to the wells is an area on the farm called Block H, and we have a picture of it, and I'll show it in a minute. And in Block H, they intend to desludge the effluent pond and spread manure solids from the bottom of the effluent pond. The plan for the dairy calls for 100% land application of all waste created by the cows. 100% is to stay on the farm in theory. In reality, we've had the farm plan reviewed by dairy specialists, and they say there's absolutely nothing that can keep the waste on the farm site. It's liquid. It's going to be liquefied further with irrigation and even further with rain. So it's going to be impossible. 90% of it is supposed to go on the ground naturally when the animals drop it. 10% is going to be collected from the milking parlors and the raceways and washed into effluent ponds. That's the plan. That's what it calls for. So feel free to come up and get a copy of Mark Madison's report, the agricultural engineer who explains in fairly clear detail why this won't work in this location, and take an excerpt from the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Services study. And you can access many documents on our website, friendsofmahalapu.org. We have a wonderful webmaster who's devoted much of her time to building our website, and then I and other members send her emails and say, what do you think, should we load this? And Kelly will get back to us and say, no problem, and she'll figure out ways to put things on the website. Right now we're trying to add an area where people can also sign up if they're interested in being part of a community-based rights ordinance, because Kauai needs protection against industrial operations. They really do. We're a small island with limited resources, and we can't afford to lose our drinking water, the quality of our air, or the quality of our soil, much less all the ocean life and reefs that are going to be affected by the nitrates. And Dr. Berg will probably go into that in greater detail. But thank you, and I'll get back to you with a little bit more. And right now I'd like to turn it over to Gary Hooser, who's been one county councilman that has consistently tried to protect the island from pollution. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you, Bridget. Let's give Bridget another big hand. You know, Bridget and her great team of friends and volunteers are responsible for putting this on today, the food, for bringing over all the speakers, and so it's a really, I want to thank you, Bridget, for doing that. My name is Gary Hooser. Many, if not most of you, I've met or come into contact over the years. I'm your county council member, if you haven't met me. I used to serve in the Hawaii State Senate. I served for 8 years representing Kauai and Ni'ihau. And for 4 of those years, I was majority leader. And Governor Abercrombie appointed me to be the director of the Office of Environmental Quality Control before I ran for re-election or election to the Kauai County Council in 2012. And, you know, I represent you. You have 7 council members, but we represent each of you for the whole island. And it's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk real briefly a little bit about the issues on the west side, as Bridget commented, but I want to say first how much in common they have with the dairy issue. And for me, it started with questions, as I'm sure it did with Bridget and many of you. You know, you hear about a project, you hear about potential questions or things, so you start asking questions. And then you find out the answers aren't quite as clear as you'd like them to be. Then you find out that people giving you the answers are downright lying to you and misleading you, and that causes you to ask more questions and more questions and more questions. And just like the dairy, this is not about a dairy, really. The west side is not about corn. It's about impacts on a community. It's about an industrial agricultural operation or operations, and what kind of impacts do they have in your community. With the dairy, you know, there's many. There's water, there's smell, there's flies. And with the west side, there's also many impacts there too. When I first got involved with it, it started with questions. People in the community would come up and say, Gary, can you help us? Can you do something? And there was a wide range of people from the west side, from all parts of the island, all ethnicities, ages, were asking these same questions over and over again. So I went to the industry. We had a meeting in my office at the county building. And I said, you know, people are concerned. And it's my job as a council member to explore those concerns and deal with them as they may need to be dealt with. And so I started asking them questions about their pesticide use, about their agricultural operations. And they proceeded to, the kind way to say it is be less than forthright with me. You know, they would tell me things that weren't quite true. They would say, Gary, we're only using the same pesticides every other farmer uses, which is absolutely not true. They would say, Gary, this is public information. And I, as a council member, went out to get it and found out it's not. Some of it is, but most of it's not. It's very difficult to get. They would say, Gary, we're not experimenting with pesticides. And I would discover experimental use permits for pesticides. They would say, Gary, the pesticides do not drift. And then the state, lo and behold, would do air testing and water testing and find out that these pesticides show up in the air at Waimea Canyon School and the water of Kekaha Ditch and other places. And albeit small amounts. But small amounts over long periods of time, chronic exposure has health effects also. So I was exposed to this misleading dialogue over and over and over again. And as a result of that misleading dialogue, my concerns increased. And working with a group in the community, put together Bill 2491. It went through the process about, I want to say a year, probably wasn't quite a year. 6 of 7 council members voted and overrode the mayor's veto. It went into law. And promptly the industry took us to court. We lost our first round in court. The federal magistrate ruled that the state, and you're going to hear a little bit about this from Paul, our guest speaker, about preemption. The federal magistrate ruled the state's authority preempted county authority. And in this case, it was what they called implied preemption. It wasn't explicit preemption or express preemption. To be clear, there is no state law, there's no federal law, and there's no court cases that say the counties do not have the legal authority to regulate pesticides. So there's nothing that says we cannot regulate pesticides. Again, no court case, no state law, and no federal law. But the federal magistrate ruled the state intended to preempt us. so it's the intended preemption was what they ruled on. On June 15th in Honolulu, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is hearing our appeal. And I'm hopeful and confident that we will prevail in some form or shape. There's many legal issues involved, but preemption is the main one. After Kauai passed our measure, the Big Island passed a separate measure, and then shortly after that, the citizens on Maui went out and gathered signatures and put together a ballot initiative that said basically that Monsanto had to prove they were safe before they could operate on Maui. And the citizens put that on the ballot, and the citizens, over 50% of the voters voted to pass that into law. After Monsanto spent close to $10 million fighting the citizens. The citizens spent maybe $100,000. Monsanto spent more money that's ever been spent on any election per vote in the history of the state of Hawaii, and Monsanto lost. And that's also in court. There's different legal issues for all three of those. But I think, regardless of the issue, it is an incredible testament to citizen involvement and grassroots efforts against a major corporation, the effort of the people on Maui and on Kauai too, but the Maui miracle is what they're calling it. So we're going to court to hear our appeal on June 15th. In the meantime, there's lots of other stuff going on, and I'll try to be fairly brief. Recently, 10 Syngenta workers, unfortunately field workers, were exposed to a chemical called chlorpyrifos in the fields. And they were sent to Waimea Kauai Veterans Memorial Hospital, KVMH, and were treated and released. There was actually, I think, about 29 field workers. 10 of them went to the hospital. They were treated and released, and the EPA now is investigating Syngenta, primarily focusing on worker protection issues, whether the fields were properly marked, whether those workers were properly informed and trained. Chlorpyrifos is on the schedule of the EPA to be banned. It's already banned for household use. And part of what I've learned more about pesticides than I've ever wanted to learn over the past couple of years. I've learned that Syngenta is one of the major operators here. Syngenta is a Swiss-based company. Syngenta is using pesticides, more than one type, in your backyard that it's against the law to use in their own country. They're based in Basel, Switzerland. It's against the law to use atrazine in Basel, Switzerland, in Switzerland, period. It's against the law to do open-air GE testing in Switzerland. It's against the law to use paraquat in Switzerland, and they're using it here. Paraquat's banned in 36 countries around the world. So these companies are doing things in our backyard that they're not allowed to do in their own country. And the more I learn about this, the more appalled I become. Monsanto sponsored a law in 2013 at the state legislature. The counties get their powers from the state. The state law that gives the counties their power says you have the power of police and fire. There's a paragraph that says the counties have the right to protect health, life, and property. Monsanto sponsored a bill that attempted to delete the words health and life. Okay, and I'm not making this stuff up. They were trying to take out those two words to take away my power, your power as a county to protect health and life. And that's the nature of the businesses that we're dealing with. And the list is long of examples like that. In addition to the court case, in addition to the EPA investigation that's ongoing with Syngenta, the Joint Fact-Finding Committee, which was authorized by the state of Hawaii and the county, their report will be coming out any day now. And their draft report basically reinforced all that we've been saying since we put this together, the Bill 2491. It says that we need more information, we need full disclosure. You can't study impacts. You can't study the impacts of an industry unless you have disclosure, unless you know what they're doing. So the Joint Fact-Finding Committee reinforces that need of disclosure, of buffer zones, and of testing. One thing, and then I'll wrap up. As we were going through these hearings, I've been doing politics for quite a while, and this was some of the most intense work I've been involved with. But during the middle of these hearings, we get testimony from several doctors. And it's in writing, and it's on public record. And I didn't know these doctors. They're not like they're Gary's friends. They're not like my hippie doctors from the North Shore. These are doctors delivering babies at Kauai Veterans Memorial Hospital. And they said that. They said, we're not scientists. We haven't done long-term peer-reviewed studies. But we've been delivering babies in this hospital for 8 years. And we put our information together, and we believe that there's 10 times the rate of a certain rare congenital heart defect in newborns. We don't know what causes it. We don't know if it's GMOs or pesticides. We don't know if it's a random cluster, but we are concerned about our hospital and our community. And for me, that's enough. I don't need much more than that to justify disclosure, buffers around zones around schools, hospitals, and houses, and a study. But and these are testimony from doctors who will stand by that testimony today. Again, they don't know whether it's a random cluster, they don't know what causes it, but they believe that there's a serious issue on the west side with congenital heart defects in newborns. And I'll close with this. So I wondered, and you probably wonder, what is the big deal? Why are these companies fighting so hard when all we want is disclosure, buffer zones, and a study? That's all that this bill is: buffer zones, disclosure, and a study, and not trade secrets. Specifically, we're not asking for trade secrets. So during the hearing, and I was the chair of the hearing, the executives of these four committees, companies would come forward, and there was a point, and we're all worn out. We're all tired of this whole battle. And I asked them, why don't you guys just give it up? Why don't you just let us do this? It's not that big a deal. You said it's safe. You said you're operating safely. Why don't you just let us pass this? Why are you fighting so hard? And one of the executives looked at me and he said, council member, he said, you don't understand. You don't understand that there's implications beyond the law that we're concerned with. And so I looked back at him and I said, tell me, what implications beyond the law are you concerned with? And he looked me in the eye, and this is on camera, and he says, we're concerned that other communities might want to do the same thing. Okay? And that is this is, again, I don't make this stuff up. This is on camera. And that tells you what we're dealing with. And when Paul comes up here, I think Bridget's going to talk some more, but it's about community rights. It's about us looking after our community and our backyard and looking after our natural environment. And that's why I'm doing this. I think that's why all of you are here. I know that's why Bridget's working so hard. So thank you all. I'll be around for questions afterwards too. But thank you. Aloha.
Thanks, Gary. And the one thing I should share is you'll appreciate this after you hear Paul speak, but it's pretty exciting what Kauai's doing, and the fact that we actually have a case before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. It's one step away from the U.S. Supreme Court. We're really on a cutting edge on this issue about whether a community's rights to protect its health, welfare, is a constitutionally protected right. It's in the Constitution. And corporations have constitutionally, they're not identified but they've been given constitutional rights by courts, so they have them. And there's going to be a real push to see which of the rights are given greatest value. And I think in the last analysis, if it has to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, one of my instructors in law school was Justice Anthony Kennedy. And I know he taught all of us that the power is in the people. Government is there to protect and help protect the people, but the first concern is for the citizenry. And Paul's going to share more about that with you. But before we get to Paul, just real briefly back to the dairy, and we're going to have a question and answer session. The current status of the dairy is they're very much wanting to proceed. They don't have their draft EIS completed yet. It's not out. We were told it could be out imminently, but we've not ever been given a date, and that seems to have been extended a number of times. So when exactly it will be finished, we're not sure. When it does get published, we'll have 45 days to comment on it, and everyone in the community can add comment if they feel something hasn't been adequately addressed or they feel factual information is misstated. And this is important. This is something Gary addressed. It's really true. Most of us, myself included, got particularly motivated when we went to the initial meetings because their charts with the wind vector was not the direction of the prevailing winds from east to west. Their rainfall levels were understated. They weren't the rainfall levels that the Weather Bureau, the National Institute on Oahu, our state hydrologist, Kevin Kodama, has on an Excel spreadsheet dating back to 1980. Their soil type was not free-draining volcanic soil, as they said in their initial plan. It's actually primarily a clay-based soil, which is at much higher risk for runoff. They said they had an NRCS permit completed. They actually handed us a fact sheet. That's on our website. You can see it. It's got Amy Hennessy's signature under it, and it says NRCS permit - completed. There is no such thing. When we contacted the NRCS office to say, okay, they have a permit from you, can we just get an understanding of what they needed to do to get the permit? The NRCS director for the Outer Islands said, there's no permits. We don't issue permits. We were in total disbelief. And you can still see in some of their printed material that they claim to be following their NRCS approved plan. And again, the NRCS is a federal agency. It's a division of the United States Department of Agriculture, and they put out this document up here, so feel free to help yourself to it. It's the Custom Soil Resource Report for Kauai. And their director at the Honolulu office sent our attorney, Charles Tebbett, a letter in which he said, the Natural Resource Conservation Service does not approve plans. There is no such thing as HDF's NRCS approved plan because we don't do that. And you can see Bruce Peterson's letter if you choose to, and I can get a copy to anybody who wants. We have business cards up here somewhere that has a phone number, our address, our email address, and our website again. And so our concern for Mahalapu is going to be best addressed by Dr. Berg, but it's the recreational use of Mahalapu that's very real. And one of our guests tonight said, that looks just like my grandchildren. Because before I knew it was polluted, I used to let them play there. Lots of children still play there. We handed the department current pictures, March 18th, 2016, a whole stack of them, with people in the stream, lolling in the stream where it comes out onto the beach. And this whole thing that came out in the department sanitary survey that suggested it's not a stream, it's a ditch. And yet in their sanitary survey, they keep falling back and calling it a stream. It is a stream. The Waiopili comes from the waters of the Haupu Ridge. They collect, they run onto the dairy site, and they're diverted into a ditch. It was a ditch initially started in the sugar industry, Ditch 9. And at that point, it is the Waiopili ditch. And there's ditches all through the property, and they're just going to, the manure is going to float into them, and they all ultimately exit the property and are collected in what's reconstituted as the Waiopili stream and the Wailau stream. And these are some people, and this is actually a picture of our Vice President, Eileen Kachloian, a great person who's done a ton of research to help us find a lot of the scientific evidence we found and took to the state. Her husband, Jay Kachloian, is our treasurer. He's done a great deal for this community. He's here tonight, I think. Jay, are you here? Okay. Jay donated $100,000 to our effort, one man. A terrific guy. And Eileen, you can see, has her boots on because she definitely knows what's in that water. And she's warning people. That's a picture of her somebody caught walking up to tell them you might not want to play there. So I'll take these down now and call up Dr. Berg to talk to us a little bit about our big concern. And that's the water. And it is polluted. Dr. Berg, are you here? Okay, Dr. Berg is currently serving as a head of our Surfrider Kauai chapter.
Thank you, Bridget. I'd like to start off. My name is Dr. Carl Berg. I'm a marine ecologist, marine biologist by profession, recently retired, but still way too active in monitoring water quality in the ocean and streams around here and fighting for our community's right to have clean water, which is in the state constitution, but it's also right in the county's charter, first line, that we have our health is being protected. And one of the things Gary said, which reminded me, I've been fighting to get polluted streams posted with caution warning signs. I went through the whole process about 10 years ago with the state, and we put one up at Hanalei because I had spent about $1 million of EPA money and USGS money proving that they couldn't back away from it. It was polluted. And then we cleaned it up. But they told me, this is not a precedent. Don't come back to us and ask for any other stream. I've had 3 separate heads of the Environmental Health Department say, that's not a precedent. We're not going to post streams. And so I've been fighting for years now to try to get Koloa Landing and the Willy Willy stream and Hanamaulu stream posted as warning sign because the average count in those streams is somewhere around 1,000 and it should be 35. But I attended the very first meeting of the dairy farm and went there and heard all of these blatant lies. Oh, the wind comes from this way and we have all the water we need. And it's like, what are they talking about? This is just ridiculous. And myself and a couple of my Surfrider friends who were there said, we better go down and take a look at that stream before they put any cows there so that we can say, hey, look how bad, it was nice and clean, and now look at it. Well, I personally went down there and grabbed a water sample right from the stream near the mouth and took the sample. And that was May 12th, 2 years ago. That was the first time we said, 2 years I've been water sampling there. And the counts were outrageous. So I called the Department of Health and said, hey, guys, we have a real problem. You got to come down here because the counts are astronomical. And as I went down a couple weeks later and did in front of Gillen's house and the stream, and the counts again, 10,000 or something like that. And so it was that point we said, I don't know what's going on, but there's a real problem, and it's a public health risk problem. Why is it a public health risk problem? Because I go down there and I see all the kids playing in the stream all the time and all the tourists playing in the stream all the time. And so it's a public health risk. So Surfrider started then doing extensive sampling for the bacteria that indicate that there's sewage pollution and at Mahalo in addition to every place else. And we also went in and I took water samples and had them sent to an excellent lab, Test America, and test for how much nutrients were in the water, how much nitrates and phosphates and other pollutants. We took samples and we had them tested for all the pesticides. We had the mud tested for the pesticides. We had all this tests done through donations from the community and from Friends of Mahalapu. And what we came up with was, it's polluted. It is way polluted. So the first chart, which you may or may not be able to see, but it'll be up later, Surfrider goes out on the second Saturday of every month, except this month, and we do water sampling. I have about 20 volunteers, and they all go out that morning and grab a water sample. Then I personally run a test for the bacteria loads, and here are the values from the last sampling, and I can then take an average of all of the samples that we've gotten for this year. The important thing is that any single sample should not have more than 130 bacteria in it per 100 little jar per 100 ml. 130. If it's more than that, it's polluted, and the Department of Health should put up warning signs. So if you look, I've rank ordered these. Most of our surf sites, all the water out in the ocean, nice and clean. But as soon as you get into stream mouths, like Nawili Willy, it's 400. Koloa Landing, you all know Koloa Landing, Makoma Stream. That one, the other day, it was only 985. So that's about 9 times. But the thing is, once you get down to the canals on the east side, or you get to Waiopili Stream at 6,867, these are in the thousands. And it doesn't matter whether it's animal manure or human manure. There's so many diseases in that makes it a public health threat. I know personally the Department of Health, nobody ever gets sick. I said, hey, I spent 1 day there measuring stream flow. 2 days later, I had this great big abscess on my leg. I've been sampling water in Hawaii for 20 years. I've never, ever before. How did I get it? I forgot to wash off when I got done. So I know it personally. I said, you want to see my scar? And you question me? I'm Dr. Berg. I'm a doctor, right? Marine biologist. But the big thing here is if you look at the averages, the geometric mean, which is the average of the logarithms, it's not supposed to be more than 35. And for here, so far, what we're getting now, where did we go? To Waiopili Stream, 7,753. 7,000. It's supposed to be 35. That's 250 times what. And so I said, that's way too much. I've been fighting with Department of Health when it's 1,000, but now it's 10,000 or 25,000. That's way too much. So the Department of Health had other labs test it. They got 28,000. They did their tests, and they fudged. They did a test that only read up to 2,000. So, hey, it's not bad. It's only up to 2,000. No, you didn't test higher. So what this says is that a lot of our streams and canals are really polluted, and Waiopili Stream is more so than anything else around and has been every single time. What percentage of the time that we go out there and sample Waiopili Stream is it polluted? 100% of the time. How about Koloa Landing? 99% of the time, something like that. All the time, these are polluted. So I've been pushing to get the Department of Health put up signs. They did because I screamed and yelled so much, they did a sanitary survey, which meant they went out and tried to figure out where it came from. However, they made the mistake in writing that of thinking that I was blaming the dairy farm. And I wasn't blaming the dairy farm, I was blaming the landowner who owns the whole valley, and everything rushes in. And I don't know where the high pollution levels have come from. It's probably pigs. However, in doing the tests, test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4, 4 different tests, and they all said that human sewage is in there. And where could it be coming from? And that's when we discovered that there was a sludge dumping site across from CJ's stables, right on the lava rocks with all those lava tubes. That has to be where it's coming from. It's not from the dairy farm, but I don't care. The Surfrider doesn't care, in a sense, who the property owner is, where it has to be filled up, and that stream has to be clean before you can think about putting in 2,000 cows and all their manure. And once the stream is clean, it's against the state law to make it more polluted. So you can't put a dairy farm there. But there are other this is public health risk, the pollution in bacteria and diseases. But the other thing that we looked at is how much nutrients were in the water. And the nutrients would come from fertilizer put on the fields, and it would also come from sewage, ammonia, nitrates, phosphates, and the state has laws that say only so much can be in those areas. So I went out and did 5 sets of samples over a different period of times and sent them off to an independent lab in the mainland who did top quality tests on them. And basically what came out was that it exceeded the state limit all the time for the ammonia, nitrates, phosphates, all the time. So the Department of Health sent their own specialists, the U.S. Geological Survey guys, out, and they did tests for the nitrates. They also looked for all these other chemicals that could indicate sewage, and they found some. But the big thing is, when they did all the nitrogen tests, they came out just about the same as what I had done a year earlier. So that confirms that these levels are all, the water there, and the groundwater there is already polluted with a huge amount of nutrients. And you can't blame it on the pigs. There's not that many pigs. And it's in the groundwater. It's in the wells. And so where is it coming from? Again, my only guess, and they're not sharing any data with me anymore, is that it's coming from the sludge dumping site up there. And all of the nutrients, the ammonia and nitrates and phosphates from that human sludge is just percolating down and will for years and years. Same sort of thing happened on Maui with the injection wells from the county of Maui. Those went underground 2 miles and then finally came in the ocean, causing the seaweeds. One of the other measurements here are total suspended solids, or turbidity. That shows how muddy the water is. Those are numeric. And it's supposed to be 2, and the values are, what are they? They're 24, 47, 46, 42. They're off the charts. They're 20 times. That's a muddy, muddy stream. And why is it muddy? Because the water is running off the land and into the stream. So what happens when you put cows on it? It's going to be even worse. So what we've done is, doing all of these tests over the years, is to show that already the Mahalo Valley is polluting that stream, and that stream, according to Department of Health standards, is a Class 1A, the most protected stream level in the state, because it's in a conservation area right at the beach. So anybody inland, Mauka, they can't pollute that clean water. They are. So they have to start cleaning it up. Again, I'm not targeting the dairy farm per se. I'm targeting that whole area. I'm targeting the landowner, Grow Farm. That's saying there's something bad going in that whole area, but a dairy farm going in there would just be the stupidest thing you can imagine, because it will just kill that whole stream totally. So it doesn't matter what level or what pollution index you use, whether it's bacteria or nitrates or phosphates or turbidity or total solids, that stream is highly polluted, and we need to clean it up before we go any further with that. I'd just like to follow up that Surfrider is also, because of our friendship with Gary, we're also looking at pesticides. And when Gary and Robert and I had a meeting at Tip Top right at the very beginning, and Gary said, what data is there out there about pesticides in the water? There is no data. So Surfrider started taking samples, which has led now to the intent to sue the Agricultural Development Corp on the west side for all the pesticide pollution of all the ditches on the west side. How do we know it's polluted? Because Department of Health did samples, and we did 5 times the number of samples, and they all showed that there was glyphosate, atrazine, metallochlor in those things. They're polluted. And I thought it was wonderful in the newspaper article the other day, the guy who runs ADC, the last sentence in this news reporter thing, he said, you got to be crazy. We wouldn't pollute the environment. You got to be crazy. And it was, wait, look at the State Department of Health data. You are, you're crazy. You're polluting it. There's no doubt about that. And that's what we told the Joint Fact-Finding Commission, that they're polluting the water in the ditches. We need buffer zones. They may be doing everything according to the law. It's not working. But I want to add one other thing that I'm really proud of. It gets with this pesticide pollution. I had a high school student come to me who was really concerned about pesticides, and she knew about our water testing. We came up with this great science fair project, and we went and got honey, and we looked for Roundup in honey. And what we found was that there's a lot of Roundup in the honey when you're all around large-scale agriculture or golf courses, and if you're in Molawa'a organic farm area, there's nothing. Lahui, around houses, a little teeny bit. We're following up on that, but we found that our food supply is, by air drift, is being polluted by these pesticide companies who claim there is no overspray, there is no drift, it doesn't leave the property, we're perfectly safe. And we told the Joint Fact-Finding Commission, no, and here's the data. I'm a scientist, my students work with me, we're scientists. Here are the numbers. You just can't argue against those numbers. If you have any questions, when we're done with Paul's talk, I'll be glad to answer those.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. One thing, I know Carl feels that the state's biosolids treated human sewage dump site in Mahalapu may be contributory, and it may be. But I was very much impressed with the fact that in 2008 and 2010, when the department tested the water coming out at Gillen's house, those waters were not polluted then. In 2011, there was a little elevation, but nothing in the thousands, not even near 1,000. But in 2014, after the dairy began their grubbing and grading and ditch clearing, the waters became seriously polluted. How much that grubbing and grading contributed, we'll never really know. But as Carl said, the big picture is the whole place is very, very polluted. The mud that's still coming down there is still coming from active earth moving in ditches. We saw signs of it as recently as March of this year when we did a site visit. So Friends of Mahalapu has a Clean Water Act case that's pending before the federal court, and that's underway thanks to a lot of good people like yourselves who've donated hard-earned money and have supported our effort to get the attention for the stream and the valley that it deserves. And in a Clean Water Act case, if our judge finds that the landowner and or the tenant and or the lessees that Grove Farm leased land to for 11 years, they were dumping biosolids in there. If the landowner is responsible in any way for the pollution that we see of the waters of the U.S., the most highly protected waters, the fines can be as much as $37,500 per day. So we're underway and we'll keep you posted. Right now I'm going to finish my part, the dairy update, by asking Jan Muller to come up and talk about a little personal experience because as someone said, we have the bacteria, we have the pollution of our water, that's a big concern. We have the air quality, but we also have the pests that come with dairies. Jan, are you here? Yay.
Can you hear me all right? Right there's good? Okay. Bridget invited me to speak to you because I have personal experience with dairy farm in several different ways. But first thing I want to say before I start is that I absolutely love and admire small family farms. It's hard work, but it's so healthy for us and for the environment. And I think that's the way of the future. We must support small family farms and even tear up some of our backyards and plant some vegetables and some fruit trees. That's called sustainability. And just as an example, just one sentence or two of sustainability. I grew up on a dairy farm. My mother and father were teachers, but my dad wanted to live on the farm. So he bought the farm from his brother, 2 brothers and sister. It was 109 acres. And they started small, of course, and we all worked hard. 2 jobs for my parents, of course. And we got up to the point, by the time I was a teenager and my older brothers were adults, of farming 378 acres. And we had 100 dairy cows milking. That means you had some Herefords and some bulls and some calves and a few horses and a few pigs otherwise. But 100 dairy cattle, and we're talking 2,000. Now with this 100 dairy cattle, there are several things that were very difficult. Number one, the flies were absolutely terrible. And if it rained, the smell was horrendous. It was unbelievable. We had an expert entomologist here up in Princeville. His name's Carlos White. And he taught us some things. He wrote a letter to the mayor and to, I think we had it on the website way back in 2014. This is what he taught us. He did his master's thesis on the housefly. One fly lays about 300 eggs. The perfect medium, like a petri dish, is damp manure. In 3 days, you have 300 maggots in that pile of manure. Within 12 days, you have 300 new flies. Within several months, you have billions of flies. Then we add the horse flies, the deer flies, the stable flies, and the horn flies, which are also part of a dairy farm. They bite, and they are blood-sucking. Now the housefly can go 5 miles pretty easily, and then you add our trade winds. There will be many flies at Kauai Community College. There will be many flies in Colorado. And as far as the biting, blood-sucking flies, they like our blood too. So if there aren't any animals nearby, ours is good. And it's not pleasant, and it hurts, and it carries diseases. My sisters and I had impetigo 2 or 3 different times. I don't know if you're familiar. It's very common around dairy farms. It is red blotches around your nose and mouth with blisters. It's ugly and it's itchy, and it's not pleasant. That's very common around dairy farms, and we know exactly what that feels like. And the smell when it rains, I can't describe it. I grew up with a fly swatter in my hand, and so did my sisters. We had fly stickers, I forget what that was called. Yes, hanging from our 3 or 4 places in our kitchen, which we changed practically daily so that we could enjoy our meal, and in between we would hit the flies with our swatters. I'm telling you some of the downsides. And then here's a really bad downside. Dairy farms, like most farms, big farms in particular, the pollution is terrible. The water gets terribly polluted. As an example, which is very painful to me, my dad had 3 brothers and a sister on the farm. And my grandfather had told them very clearly, don't you ever, ever, ever put 1 drop of any of this water to your mouth. It's very dangerous. And you know how kids are sometimes. Well, one of the 20-year-old, very healthy, hardworking brothers didn't take his thermos, and his sister didn't bring fresh water at lunchtime. So he decided he had to have some water. So he went to the upper edge of one of our pastures where there's a fence, and on the other side is a potato farm. And he thought, well, if I just jump under this fence and drink a little bit on that side of the fence, I'll probably be okay. So he bent down, water in his, drank it, and he was dead within a week. So I'm scared to death about several things. I'm scared to death about the water pollution in that stream where little children are playing, and neither the health department nor Grove Farm will put up a sign to warn people. I'm petrified of what it's going to do to our water supply. If you've been following the paper, it's predicted that in 10 years, Kauai will have a water shortage. And Grove Farm, as part of the lease to the Kauai Dairy Farm, promises them 3 million of water a day from our Waiatai Reservoir. You see why I'm frightened, and we all should be frightened? And now we need to learn what we can do about it. And that's part of the next speaker. So it's Paul's turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of the amazing folks that I've met over the last week from the Friends of Mahalapu, who have been such gracious hosts and showing me all over this gorgeous island that I've never been to before. It's very exciting to be here. I'm a Portland, Oregon resident. Especially want to thank Bridget for the extraordinary amount of work she does. I'd like to give her a round of applause for how much work she's doing. I'm a longtime grassroots community organizer and educator in the community rights movement, which you'll know a lot more about in a half an hour after my presentation is completed. It's a very intriguing social movement that started in 1999 in a small conservative family hog farm community in Pennsylvania, which I'll tell you more about in a couple of minutes. It has spread across the United States to 200 communities in 9 states. Communities taking back their authority to exercise their right to govern themselves and protect their own health and welfare. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history and how corporations came to be so powerful, I'm going to talk about the community rights movement as a response to that history, and I'm going to tie it into the dairy farm proposal here. And I'll talk for about a half an hour or so. I want to start with, I start a lot of my talks with this claim. It is the people, it is we the people, who give the county, Kauai County, the authority to govern, and not the other way around. It is we the people who give the state of Hawaii the authority to govern, and not the other way around. It is we the people of the United States of America who give the federal government the authority to govern, and not the other way around. And the reason that that is that way is because of what happened during and after the American Revolution, when those who were active in the American Revolution made it very clear that life and liberty were going to be established for all people. Unfortunately, in the early days, all people, all persons under law meant white men with property, which was a tiny percentage of us at the time. Fortunately, it means most of us today. But people fought very hard in the American Revolution, not just to create basic democratic structures, but to create those democratic structures locally. And in fact, one of the earliest state constitutions in the United States enshrined the right of local community self-government, and this was fairly common in the first decade after the American Revolution. The first Pennsylvania Constitution was called the Declaration of the Rights of the Inhabitants of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And here's just one paragraph post-American Revolution from the Pennsylvania Constitution: that government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community, and not for the particular emolument or advantage of any single man, family, or set of men who are only part of that community, and that the community has an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish government in such manner as shall be by that community judged most conducive to the public wealth. And that kind of language has continued to this day. There's very little revolutionary language from the American Revolution left in our core documents, but it's there. And one of the places is in the first few paragraphs of every state constitution. It's an American Revolution remnant. And your constitution begins Article 1, Bill of Rights, Section 1, Political Power. All political power of this state is inherent in the people, and the responsibility for the exercise thereof rests with the people. All government is founded on this authority. In other words, if there isn't consent of the governed in Hawaii or in any other state in the Union, there isn't legitimate government. Does that make sense? If there isn't consent, your government isn't legitimate. And we've gotten to a point in the United States that there isn't consent on a whole variety of topics. There's, in most communities, there are environmental crises going on. This crisis with the dairy isn't unusual, and I'm sure almost everyone in the room knows that. I mean, many of you probably escaped from other places in the United States and elsewhere where you were escaping other environmental crises or social movement, social justice, or economic injustice crises. So we're all, in a way, experts in the United States right now in experiencing a lack of consent of the governed. So I'm going to explain to you what happened in 1999 in this small township of Wells, Pennsylvania. Wells Township, Pennsylvania. 520 folks, mostly small family farm community, mostly hog farms, mostly conservative folks. And this was the birthplace of, we didn't know it at the time, but this was really the beginning of the community rights movement in the United States. And you'll see how this all ties in a few minutes with what you're doing here, your concerns here. In around 1996, the farmers in Wells Township, Pennsylvania, discovered that they were going to be the recipients of a 15,000 head factory farm of hogs coming from a large corporation in the Deep South. It had already filed an application with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And they were not pleased about this proposal. That was not the vision that the farmers had for the future of their community. They didn't want their kids and grandkids having to live in a community with a hog farm of 15,000 hogs. And as you can imagine, just as you're dealing with 2,000 cattle, there's the stench, and there's the concern about the poop and urine ponds overflowing or leaking into creeks or into the ocean. There's the property value drop. There's all sorts of human health concerns. Well, being patriotic farmers, they assumed that there was somewhere they could go in Pennsylvania to say, as a community that was overwhelmingly together on this one, we don't want this factory farm in our community, so could you just deny the application, please? And they assumed, because they understood they were we the people, the sovereign people, which they had learned in civics class, and that government serves us and has duties and responsibilities to us, that there was somewhere they could go to get this to happen. And they talked to the assistant director of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They traveled to this fellow's office, and he welcomed them into his office, and he said, we're working currently on a manure management plan for this application. We'd love for your input on this manure management plan. And the farmers were a little bit stunned because they hadn't really come to talk about a manure management plan. They'd come to say, we want the application denied. And the administrator for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture said, well, that's really not how we operate here. We're a regulatory agency. And the way regulatory agencies operate is that once an application is considered what's called administratively complete, that application is generally approved. So once all of the environmental studies have been attached, or the health studies, or the social whatever studies, and the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed, the application is approved. How many people have been to a regulatory hearing of a state or federal agency? That's it? Really? Just a handful of you? Come on, tell me. How many of you have been to a regulatory? It's that small. I'm surprised. It's usually much greater. So the experience that most people have at regulatory hearings, and if you follow the news in the Pacific Northwest where I live, we've been battling oil and coal train proposals through the Northwest now for the last 3 or 4 years. And we've actually stopped 5 of 6 oil and coal train export terminals in the Pacific Northwest in the last couple of years. And it's taken tens and tens of thousands of people showing up at these public hearings and claiming that they're going to do civil disobedience if the public will is ignored. The reason I'm mentioning this situation is that a lot of people who've gone to regulatory hearings have discovered that it doesn't matter whether 90, 95, 98% of the hundreds of people, the thousands of people who attend a regulatory hearing, if they're all on the same side, if they're all saying we don't want this thing in our community, that if the permit is administratively complete, it almost always gets approved. So there's a structural problem with the regulatory system, clearly. And so the movement that I'm part of studied what is the history of the regulatory arena of law, that the regulatory directors seem to be completely, it's completely irrelevant what the public wants in their own community. And what they discovered is that the history of the regulatory arena of law started in the 1880s when the Attorney General of the United States met privately with the executives of the railroad corporations, 1880s, which were the first giant corporations of our country. And the large railroad corporations were causing significant harm to people and to the landscape that they were passing through. And at that time, corporate harm, believe it or not, was prohibited by their charters. Corporate charters said that each corporation was to serve one specific social need and to cause no harm. And the Industrial Revolution period of the mid to late 1800s created a whole different kind of economic development. And it was very clear to the industrial leaders that they had to figure out a way to get from prohibiting corporate harm to regulating corporate harm. That was a major shift in the culture and the politics and the reality of the United States at the time. From prohibiting corporate harm to regulating corporate harm. That happened in the late 1800s. So In the 1880s, the railroad industry met with the Attorney General, and they created what was the first regulatory agency in U.S. history. It was called the Interstate Commerce Commission. And it was basically designed to look like a bold response to public outrage against the railroads, but in fact it was designed to tie the public up in knots and make them as irrelevant as possible in their own situation. Here's a couple of quotes. The Attorney General, Richard Olney at the time, explained to railroad corporation executives that this new agency was, quote, to be a sort of barrier between the railroad corporations and the people, unquote. Said Charles Adams, president of Union Pacific Railroad, seeing what was needed to solve the railroad corporation's problems, quote, what is desired is something having a good sound but quite harmless, which will impress the popular mind with the idea that a great deal is being done, when in reality very little is intended to be done. That was the regulatory system. The public was to be pacified with laws that sounded tough, but placed much discretion in the hands of regulators. And the system worked so well to frustrate the public, to challenge the harms caused by railroad corporations, that one industry after another then demanded its own regulatory agency. So when we look at the regulatory agencies in the present day, be they the Hawaii Department of Agriculture, the USDA, Hawaii Department of Health, the National Labor Relations Board, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Departments of Forestry at the state and federal level, all of these agencies come out of an extraordinary history that we don't really understand. Although I think we understand it in our gut, because they seem to pretty much ignore the will of the people. And it's not that the will of the people is being ignored because the agencies have been captured by large corporations. For example, I hear all the time, Monsanto, I hear activist group leaders say, Monsanto Corporation has seized control of the USDA, for example. And the sad truth is, it's actually a pretty scary truth, is that the regulatory system of law is a corporate system of law. And it has been since the 1880s. That you can't expect to get justice for your community through the regulatory system because regulatory law is written with the active participation of the industries being regulated. Regulatory directors, agency directors, frequently are in revolving door with the industries that they regulate. So the whole regulatory system is corporate territory. It's not a seized system. It was designed to work the way it works, and it works very, very well, thank you, for its purpose. So the farmers are experiencing this in the flesh with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And they're really stunned, and they go back to their community because they can't get what they want from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They go back to their community and they say to public interest environmental attorneys that are working with them on this application to try to get it declined, why can't we protect our own community? Why is it that there's nowhere we can go in the state to get the permit application denied? What is going on here? We thought that the sovereign people have authority to protect the health and welfare of their community. And these public interest attorneys explain to them that there are 3 structures of law in this country that are hidden in plain sight. And this is really important for folks to understand. And that these 3 structures of law make it literally illegal for a local government, a city or town or county government, to pass a law that prohibits a corporation from harming you in your own community. It's illegal because of these structures of law for a local government to pass a law that prohibits that corporate activity that would automatically, inevitably create that corporate harm. And here are the 3 structures of law. And it's really important that we, the people of this country, understand these structures. And I'm not telling you conspiracy theory here. This stuff is out there. Just look it up. It's right there. It's not hard to find. The first one is called state preemption. And I'll bet a whole bunch of you have heard of state preemption, because the lawsuit that's currently active with Kauai and Maui and Hawaii counties all involve challenging corporate harms and being told by judges, I'm sorry, you can't. What you're trying to do is preempted by the state. State preemption in this specific case, in this specific situation, is easy to explain. If the state regulates a corporate activity, a local government is not allowed to prohibit that corporate activity. It's that straightforward. So if the state of Hawaii regulates GMO agriculture, or regulates factory farms, or regulates clear cutting, or regulates oil trains on the tracks, or regulates big box stores, if there's a state agency or a federal agency that regulates, i.e. allows that corporate activity, a local government is not allowed to prohibit that corporate activity because of state preemption. On the flip side of state preemption, kind of the flip side of the same coin, is something called Dillon's Rule, D-I-L-L-O-N''S, Dillon's Rule. And Dillon, full name John Forrest Dillon, 2 R's in Forrest, John Forrest Dillon, was a late 1800s state Supreme Court judge in Iowa. And because he was an elite individual, he was a state Supreme Court judge, he had a particular idea about government. And he started integrating this idea into his court decisions, and it came to be known as Dillon's Rule. And his idea was incorporated by the U.S. Supreme Court starting in the early 1900s. Dillon's Rule says, in so many words, that the proper relationship between state government and local government is that of parent to child. That obviously the state is the parent, the local is the child, and what that means is that the state government has all the authority, and the local government only has the authority granted to it by the state government. That the local government is a mere tenant of the state, said John Forrest Dillon. That the state gets to decide what kinds of lawmaking a local government can make and what kinds of lawmaking it has no authority to make. So generally, in terms of corporate activity, the local government has almost no authority. It's allowed to do zoning, and some local governments try to use zoning to prohibit a corporate activity. But zoning isn't about prohibition. It's not about saying no, it's about saying where, right? Yes to this site, no to that site. And so some local governments think they're very clever by zoning corporate activity completely out of the county. And they're frequently sued, and they usually lose. Because zoning is not about prohibiting, it's about deciding where it goes. Other than zoning and nuisance law, which is your neighbor has a junked car in the front yard collecting rats and is refusing to deal with it, let's say, that's a nuisance activity that is usually complaint-based. Those are about the only two things that local governments tend to have authority over when it comes to corporate activity. So that's Dillon's Rule. And if you've ever wondered how did it come to be that the Michigan government is able to dissolve city councils in the state of Michigan and replace them with emergency managers appointed by the governor, they can do that because of this law, because of Dillon's Rule. That Dillon's Rule recognizes that the local government is a mere subdivision of the state, that it doesn't have its own integral authority, right? Does that make sense? Right? It's just a subdivision. Now, there was another guy, Thomas Cooley, who was also a state judge in the late 1800s. He was a constitutional law scholar. And he firmly believed, Cooley believed, that the authority of local government comes directly from the people who live there. Well, that idea has gone down the memory hole. And Dillon's Rule has come to serve us as the ruling structure. And there are about half of the states in the United States are Dillon's Rule states, and Hawaii, tragically, is one of those states. So that's flip sides of the same coin. State preemption says what the states legalize and regulate, a local government can't prohibit. Flip side of the coin, Dillon's Rule says the local government only has the authority to pass laws in the areas of operation the state allows it to. Okay? And then we come to the third structure of law, and it's called corporate constitutional rights. And I put up this really interesting timeline on the wall here, this big banner, is a timeline of corporations being granted constitutional rights for 196 years by the U.S. Supreme Court. The legislatures have never granted rights to corporations. Our presidents, our governors have never granted rights to corporations. It's all entirely through the courts, mostly the U.S. Supreme Court, occasionally a state Supreme Court. 200 years, 196 years of corporations being granted constitutional rights and protections by the courts, which is really an outrage if you think about it, because corporations are just legal fictions. That's one of the descriptions of them. They're not people, they're not living beings. Corporations are merely business structures, right? And a legal fiction is a term that's used because they're legal, they exist under law, but they're a fiction in reality. In other words, if I asked you to take a picture of Monsanto Corporation, you actually couldn't do that. You could take a picture of its buildings, its headquarters, its directors, its agricultural fields, but the Monsanto Corporation legal fiction, doesn't exist in the material world. It's a business structure that exists in our minds. Just like government is a legal fiction. It's a concept that exists in our minds. So imagine how crazy it is to grant constitutional rights to something that doesn't even exist in the material world. So over the last 196 years, and I'll give you a couple of examples, corporations have won property rights, they've won free speech rights, they've won religious freedom rights, they've won rights against search and seizure, they've won right to a jury trial, they've won privacy rights, they've won access to a number of clauses in the Constitution. A couple of crazy examples. In the 1960s, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you try to stop a cell phone tower in your community, has anybody tried to do that on Kauai? I bet somebody has. If you try to do that, you're going to run right up against something called the 1996 Telecommunications Act that was passed by the federal government. And in the Telecommunications Act, it says that a local government does not have the authority to consider the human health impacts of a cell phone tower placement in their community, because that would violate a corporation's civil rights, as if corporations were oppressed black people. I'm not making this up, right? Civil rights protections for corporations. The reason that we can't limit money in politics by corporations is because of a 1976 Supreme Court decision, Buckley versus Vallejo, that opened the floodgates of corporate money and equated for the first time the right to speak with the right to give unlimited amounts of money. It's called the money equals speech decision by activist communities in 1976. The reason that the labeling, if you've ever looked at the labeling of a dairy product that says does not contain, this dairy product is bovine growth hormone free. I bet some of you have seen that on labels, on dairy labels. Well, the Vermont legislature in 1996 tried to pass a law that required the labeling of bovine growth hormone in products sold in Vermont. And the companies that used bovine growth hormone in their milk, in their dairies, sued and went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't require this product contains bovine growth hormone on the label, because that would violate a corporation's right to not speak, which is a subsidiary right, they argued, of the corporation's right to speak, which is a free speech right of a corporate person. So, I mean, the stories are really extraordinary. There's a book on the table. I have a bunch of books and literature, free handouts and books priced as marked. And there's a book on the table called Gaveling Down the Rabble that I have a couple copies left of. And it's all about corporations winning constitutional rights. And it's really an extraordinary story. So coming back to the farmers in rural Pennsylvania, they learned about these three structures of law from the activist attorneys, the public interest attorneys in Pennsylvania. And they were absolutely stunned. And they finally understood this is why we can't pass a law in our community, because it's going to be challenged by all of these bizarre structures of law that we consider unjust and illegitimate, because they violate our rights. And the farmers said to these public interest attorneys in 1999, okay, well, so we can't do it because it's going to be legally challenged, but what if we do it anyway? What if we pass a law that bans factory farm? What's the worst that's going to happen? Well, the attorneys said to the farmers, you're welcome to ask us to draft a law to ban factory farms in your community. But you have to understand that that law would violate corporate constitutional rights, Dillon's rule, and state preemption. But we're happy to do it for you, if that's what you want. They wrote it. It was passed unanimously by the Township Council of Wells in 1999, and it banned factory farms. And the most amazing thing happened. The application was pulled from the table at the Department of Agriculture by the large factory farm corporation. They didn't sue, they just pulled the application. And that was the beginning of the community rights movement. And to fast forward just for a few minutes to get us to the present in the community rights movement, 20 more rural conservative communities in Pennsylvania then passed pretty much identical ordinances trying also to stop corporate factory farms from moving in. 2 communities in rural Maine passed ordinances to ban corporations bottling water, sucking up groundwater and putting it in little bottles for sale around the world. That was banned in Maine in 2 communities. Communities in Pennsylvania also banned corporate dumping of urban sewage sludge onto rural farmland in their counties. And then about 5 years ago, we had this extraordinary shift in what the community rights movement was doing. It went from simple bans, simple local bans, to being much more a sense of not just what we're trying to stop, but what is our grander vision for what we want? What kind of community do we want to be creating for ourselves and our children and grandchildren in the future? And so it went from prohibition-based ordinances to rights-based ordinances. And it began with the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania City Council passing 7-0 about 5 years ago the Right to Water and Self-Government Ordinance, which was an ordinance that banned fracking. It recognized for the first time that all of the living beings, both people and nature, that were alive in the city of Pittsburgh had the right to water, and that fracking had to be banned in Pittsburgh because it violated everyone's right to water. And that became kind of the model and the template for the community rights movement starting about 5 years ago. And ever since then, the movement has really just exploded across the United States. There are now 200 communities in 9 states that have passed community rights ordinances. And each community rights ordinance includes 3 pretty extraordinary elements. Each ordinance bans a particular harmful corporate activity that is normally considered legal, like a factory farm of dairy cows, right? It's completely legal and regulated, but the community doesn't want it. So rather than trying to regulate that harm, which is what we're used to in this country, a community would prohibit that specific corporate activity. That's the first one. It enshrines the inherent right of a local community to protect its health and welfare, regardless of what the state says, that if it wants to increase its environmental protection in its own local lawmaking, it nullifies the state's authority over it through state preemption and Dillon's rule. It says, if you don't let us increase our environmental protection because of Dillon's rule and state preemption, we're going to nullify the enforceability of those 2 state structures of law within our community, within the boundaries of our community. So in other words, it says we're not going to recognize state preemption and Dillon's rule if they violate our right to protect our own health and welfare. And the third thing is it strips that sector of corporations of all of their so-called constitutional rights. So every ordinance does these 3 things. Bans a particular corporate activity, enshrines the right of self-government locally, which again is not such a radical idea. We had it for the first 10 years or so in the United States. And it strips that sector of corporations of their constitutional rights. And so what I find really amazing, as you can imagine, this is a pretty big culture shift for a community to pass an ordinance like this. And because these laws challenge these existing structures of law, as you can imagine, there may be lawsuits against local communities. And what's been really striking is that of the 200 communities in 9 states, 95% of the communities have never yet been legally challenged. They haven't been sued by the corporation or by the state. So that's approximately 190 of 200 communities were not sued, which means 190 communities stopped the corporate harm before it ever arrived in the community. That's really quite extraordinary. Let's see, where was I going to go next? I'm almost finished. It's so funny how fickle the brain is. It's like you're on a roll, and then all of a sudden something happens in your brain, and it's just blank. That's definitely one direction I could take this. I wasn't quite where I was headed, but I'm going to get there sooner or later anyway, so I will go there next. Thank you, Felicia. So yes, of course, you may wonder, why are so few lawsuits? Because these are challenging structures of law that lawyers have not challenged, communities have not challenged in a very long time. If there are lawyers in the room, you probably know that the stuff that I've mentioned is considered settled law, that activist attorneys don't even bother challenging this stuff. It's usually thrown out as a frivolous legal challenge in a courtroom. But what's so interesting is that when you step out of the regulatory framework and into what we call rights-based lawmaking, you're in a real paradigm shift moment there in the culture of your community. I just remembered what I was going to say, so I'll finish this and see if I can hold both thoughts at once. Minds are so funny. And so what happens is that these are communities that have decided culturally in their shift from being afraid of being sued to taking on these historic structures of law, that they've gotten less afraid of being sued than they are afraid of losing the health and welfare of the community. In other words, the fact the farmers, for example, in Wells Township, got to the point culturally where they couldn't imagine allowing a 15,000 head factory farm into their community. Right, just the incredible ecological destruction, just the way that people were living, right? It was like, this is not our vision for the future of our children and grandchildren. And so right now we're in a point in our culture where local communities are terrified of being sued. But what would it look like if we went through a culture shift around that? And we said, look, what's most important to us is that the health and welfare of our community is protected. And if we're going to be joining up with 200 other communities in 9 states and challenging these structures of law that violate our right to self-government, that violate our right to protect our health and welfare, why does that have to be so scary? Does that make sense? Right? But that's not where we are normally. Normally, a local government, when they find out, and I'm sure Gary can probably tell stories about this, that if the government is threatened with a lawsuit, frequently at that point the local government says, okay, well, we're not going to even do that. We're not even going to consider it, right? Because a corporation is going to sue us, right? So we have to get to the point, and they have in these 200 communities, where they're more afraid of losing their quality of life than they are of being sued. And the ordinances themselves are designed in such a way to force a really different kind of lawsuit. As I said, we're stepping out of corporate turf, which is the regulatory arena of law, and into rights-based turf that is no longer corporate. So corporate attorneys can no longer sue with their eyes closed, half asleep, right? They actually have to think about the argument that they would have to make in a court of law which says that the corporation has more constitutionally protected rights than the people who live in that community. Now, scarily enough, that's accurate. They do, under current law. Corporations have more constitutionally protected rights than you do. It's one thing for you to hear it from me, but imagine if in your county courthouse a year from now you've already passed one of our ordinances, and a corporate attorney is forced to say in your county courthouse the people of Kauai County's constitutional rights don't matter. All that matters here, Judge, is that the corporation has constitutional rights. Can you imagine? That's not somewhere a corporate attorney really wants to go when a community is mobilized. So that's one of the main reasons that our ordinances have not been sued yet. I want to just kind of sum up. Let's see. Oh, I know the one thing I wanted to close with. I got a little bit sidetracked this evening, which I haven't done in previous evenings. Is I wanted to tie this directly to the Kauai Ordinance number 2491 that's being challenged in the courts. So Kauai County in 2013 passed Ordinance 2491 that required that Dow, Syngenta, BASF, DuPont Pioneer disclose their pesticide use, their genetic engineer crop coverage, and establish pesticide-free buffer zones near public areas, schools, hospitals, and waterways. I looked at the lawsuit by these corporations against the Kauai Ordinance, and it's really interesting. These structures of law that are hidden in plain sight, you actually don't have to go very far to find corporations using these exact structures in their arguments. They have to, because that's actually how they have rights over you. So right in the first 6 or 8 pages, I found 3 very relevant pieces. The corporations claim that the Kauai Ordinance violates their federal and state, this is a quote, their federal and state constitutional rights to equal protection and due process. That's the 14th Amendment that was written to turn black men who were slaves into black men who were citizens. That's the 14th Amendment, equal process, equal protection and due process. But corporations won equal protection and due process under the 14th Amendment in an 1886 Supreme Court decision, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company. It's when corporations won personhood for the first time. And so here they are arguing basically their rights under the 14th Amendment as corporate persons. So imagine if we started understanding that corporations can't have constitutional rights and that the state can't be allowed to preempt our authority to protect ourselves if we're actually going to have healthy communities. Here's another one. The ordinance, quote, takes their property without compensation, unquote. So that's a takings. And the takings come from property rights. And property rights are, again, a right in the Constitution for people, not for corporations legitimately. So here they're claiming their corporate property rights. And finally, the claim by the corporations in the lawsuit, they say that Kauai is a mere subdivision of the state and therefore does not have the authority to have passed this ordinance in the first place. And there's Dylan's rule. Okay? So I've come to this community invited by Friends of Mahalapu to introduce you to a whole different paradigm of thinking about how you protect the health and welfare of your community. And our work is very nonpartisan. We are mostly rural, conservative-led communities in the community rights movement. But progressives and Greens are also very, very active. Libertarians are leading in many communities. And I just want to encourage you to imagine that rather than tackling with having to put tens of thousands, I'm guessing, of hours you're going to end up putting into this one project to stop one dairy farm, imagine if you started putting your effort and your money, your hard-earned money, into a political process that actually takes back your self-governing authority at the county level and starts protecting under law your own community bill of rights that you write and that you enforce directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. At this point, I'd like to ask Felicia, you want to help us like you did the other night? She was great. Anyone that has questions, if you'd raise your hand, Felicia will come up to you and we'll try to answer any questions you might have for any of the issues that have been raised here for you tonight.
The sludge on the South Shore is coming from where?
There was unbeknownst to everyone who lives here that I know of, there was a lease negotiated between Grove Farm and a company by the name of Aqua Engineers, who were allowed to take, with the state's permit, the State Department of Health actually permitted this in 2003. They let them take the biosolids, which are the term for treated human sewage, dried, and they were only supposed to take dry solids. And to our knowledge, that's what we know they did. But they were supposed to take dry, treated human sewage, and they could spread it over acreage in Mahalapu Valley that happens to be across from and up toward the mountain a bit from the CJM stables. It's not exactly near the proposed dairy site, which is on the other side of the Waiopili. As the Waiopili comes off of it, it's onto the Waiopili stream side. So there's about a half mile between the two. That went on for 11 years. So between 2003 and 2014, when we could find testing that was done of the waters down there as it came onto the beach, they were normal until 2014. And then even the state found the same spike that Surfrider found. But that's what we know of the biosolids, and they could put in 269 dry metric tons a year. We had been to the state twice to meet with them to express our concerns about the volumes of waste that were going to go into this 517-acre area. And we explained that according to the plan, which you can come up here and view, and we had an engineer with computer-aided assistance take the dairy plan, and their plan is to graze the herd, the entire herd, on 6 3 to 5 acre parcels a day. And they describe mobs of 115 cows on each of 6 parcels per day. So that's their 699, and 6 parcels, 115 per. And then when they increase the herd, they expand to 2,000. Their plan says they'll be grading 330 cows per parcel, which from our perspective, as we studied it with dairy scientists' help, puts a concentrated waste load on a small 24 to 27 acres of land. So we said, how do we get a handle on this? What does it look like? And this engineer did this for us. And he showed us that basically he took 1,980 cows, pretty close to their 2,000 goal, and he distributed over 6 parcels, and that's what you see in the red lines, the 6 parcels. And the 6 parcels, and we took some of the bigger parcels to benefit the doubt, total 24 acres, and between each cow there's going to be about 2 feet. So when we went down to the state, and we were really concerned about this, we were meeting with them, Dr. Berg went with us, Eileen went, I went, several other people. We had people from Malama Mahalapu also participated telephonically. We had conference call and live person at the same time. Nothing was said about the biosolids site. None of us even knew about it. When we went back for our second meeting in October, we had been tipped off by a couple different sources. You know, there's been trucks in there dumping sewage. And one family actually saw like the honey bucket trucks that actually pump out cesspools. Thank you, cesspools. Dumping in there, not at this site, but just dumping on Grove Farm land. With or without permission, we don't know. But they didn't have a permit, and they weren't part of this operation. I think there's been a lot of abuse of that area, but at least for the biosolids site, the state fessed up when we went down October 1st of 2014 and said, you know what, there is this operation, but we want you to know it's coming to a halt because we're not renewing their permits. And we said, really? Why is that? Well, we don't think it has anything to do with what's happening over in the stream because that's kind of remote. But Dr. Berg told me right away, well, there's a karst lava tube formation that's part of our island, and stuff can travel. And if it gets in the groundwater, it can really travel, and it could marry up with the stream. And it could be the reason there's human source in part of the sewage. We just don't know all the causes. But in any case, the state said, so we're not going to renew it. And I said, well, how much, Carl said, you asked that. You ask that question. I said, how much did you let them put out there? And they said 269 dry metric tons a year. And then the director of wastewater looked at me and said, well, we're never going to let the cows do that much. And I said, Ms. Pruder, 700 cows do produce that much in a year, more than that, because the EPA office in San Francisco taught me how to compute the dry metric tons. So I shared it with her. And it's basically 20% of their total output. Each mature dairy cow puts out 143 pounds of wet manure a day, one of me, every day. And you multiply 143 pounds by 699 cows, or 2,000 cows. When you're at 2,000 cows, you're up to almost 300,000 pounds of wet manure per day on 24 acres. And that's 150 one-ton trucks full of manure every day. 150 one-ton trucks. Or, as the EPA said, the equivalent waste load from 328,000 people. So it was going to be many more dry metric tons. And they said, well, that's okay. We're getting them all out. They're not going to be there anymore. But I did ask Watson Okubo, who's one of their head people in the clean water branch, how long does this thing, wherever it's coming from, how long does it take to clear it up if there's human source, if there's human factor in there? And he said, years, lots of years, once it gets into the groundwater. So that's why we're still advocating this is not a good location for this operation, and we need your help. Please write letters. We've got this contact sheet up here. Come get one. We've got all their addresses, the emails. And yes, we're going to look into what Paul Cienfuegos is recommending. Go to our website, friendsofmahalapu.org. We've got a site. We want you to sign up if you're at all interested in helping with a community rights ordinance. They're lawfully passed. They're passed through the laws of the county. We'd have to do it in accordance with the county ballot initiative process. But it is something we can do, and it is more fair. It's a broader picture that any harmful large industrial operation shouldn't be allowed in Kauai, because we are a small island in the middle of the Pacific. We have limited resources, limited land, and we have people who love it. All of us do. And people who come here because it's so special, and we need to keep it special.
Bridget,
Thanks for the question.
do we have time for a second question?
Sure.
Okay.
Bridget, it's Don Heacock. I'm the vice president of the Hawaii Farmers Union United. We're a branch of the National Farmers Union that was established in 1901 to protect and enhance family intergenerational farming and sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture, at its very simplest definition, protects ecosystem integrity. It protects the ecosystem. It's economically efficient. That means you make money, but you don't pollute. It's economic accounting with no externalities. And it's socially and culturally equitable and fair to all. Now, as you remember, Bridget, myself, and about 4 others, I think, wrote the first letter in the Garden Islands saying why this would not be sustainable and would pollute not only Waiopili Stream, but the coastal coral reef ecosystems. One of the things that Bridget has been saying to you is that much of that land, about 65%, is hard pan clay, which means no water will percolate. So really, rather than having 330 cows on 5 acres, you're going to have them on 2.5 because of water and manure, and all the rain will run off. So in closing here, I haven't shared this with many, but in about 2008, way before the dairy was proposed, I wrote, because I'm a taro, fish farmer, agroforestry, avocados, chocolate. I've got about 54 crops that grow on my farm, on my 25-acre farm. I wrote to Ulupono back in 2008. I said, gee, I really want to integrate a couple of dairy river water buffalo. They'll produce milk for me. This is on 25 acres, mind you. They'll produce milk. They'll produce cheese. They'll plow, puddle, and level my taro fields. They'll pull my produce to the farmer's market. And when they're doing absolutely nothing, unlike my tractor, they'll be eating weeds, producing fertilizer, and calves. And they wrote back to me and said, I'm sorry, we don't care about family-run farms. We're an investment corporation. We're about maximizing profits. So that really tells you the struggle we've been having, and Wendell Berry's been writing about this in books for decades. The struggle between, in 1930, 95% of the United States were family-run farms. Most of your parents were farmers. I see a couple of nods in the audience. We've got to get back to the fact that, is food security important to us? How important is food security? Hell, it's really important. If you got no food, it's really important. And we need an ordinance. I strongly recommend, and in closing here, we get Paul back for a couple of weeks to do nothing but write resolutions and ordinances and draft initiatives for our ballots. It's the only way we're going to make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
Is
And
there
and
anyone else?
There isn't. I just want to share, Felicia, there is a dairy you can read about online on the Big Island, Mauna Kea Mu. They have 1,400 acres and 200 cows, and they're making money. Yeah, they're 200 cows, and they're making milk, cream, and cheese. Yeah, and they're happy doing it. It's Mauna Kea Mu. So there is responsible dairying. Alan Faya has been really an active member of the Faya family in our community. His family owned, they were 3-generation owners of the Waimea Dairy, and he and his brothers made the decision to shut it down. They were older, they leased it to Meadow Gold. Meadow Gold wasn't taking care of it properly. The waste and the flies got to be a nuisance for the community, and they non-renewed Meadow Gold's lease. So that stopped the Waimea Dairy. And for those of you who know the Molowa'a Dairy, it got to be almost 400 cows, nowhere near 699. And it was shut down for waste problem, and we had actually a man step forward the other night in Kilauea at our meeting who was personally familiar with that operation, and he stood right up and said, yeah, it was running everywhere. And he was a local gentleman, he was a Hawaiian man, and he had worked on it. So, you know, it's interesting to learn about this, but Alan told me, you know, at one time there were 36 dairies on Kauai, and that was the way to go. We had all the milk we could ever hope to have. We could make cheese, cottage cheese, we did it all. And so I know sustainability is really important, but when the state tells us this dairy is going to be good for you because it adds food sustainability, that is not the truth. They're going to import grain, they're going to export the milk. This is not a sustainable operation, rather it's an operation designed to leave us with a lot of pollution that we're going to have to clean up. And our county doesn't have the $100 billion that Des Moines, Iowa did to put in a reverse osmolarity plant when they lost their drinking water to animal agriculture. We can't afford it. So hang in there with us and help us if you can. And does anybody have another question?
I'll go get it.
Aloha and thank you, everyone. This community rights ordinance that you're proposing the citizens build their mana towards achieving, is this involved with the initiative power, the power of initiative power here in the state of Hawaii, where the citizens can bring forward an ordinance and let the citizens vote? And because we don't have a lot of support for that on this island.
It would be a ballot initiative. It would not be it would be more likely passed if very widespread organizing happened throughout the very diverse parts of this island.
Well,
Yeah,
we've had
as a ballot
experience in that,
initiative.
and people have put in thousands and thousands of hours and dollars, both on Maui and here. After 2491, there was an initiative. And my personal opinion, I've been here 40 years, is that the inside will not allow it, period. And that's the elections office, whoever controls that. So it's like being completely controlled by the corporations Therefore, is there something else we can do? Because this is going to be a waste of time, in my opinion. Is there another step that can be taken to bypass a citizens' initiative, which I feel will be not supported by the elections office, and they won't let it in onto the ballot?
I can speak to that a little bit. I mean,
Okay.
I was on the council when that happened, and I did not support that. It was a minority vote. What happened, those of you that may or may not be aware of it, there was a citizens group. They went out, they got the signatures, and they proposed a charter amendment to amend the charter. And the county clerk and the county attorneys said that the way the document was written was inappropriate. It was written as an ordinance instead of a charter amendment, and there's different rules for both, and therefore the council refused to consider it. And again, I voted against that. I thought it wasn't the council's position. If someone wants to take it to court, the courts can decide that, but it's not our decision to make. Unfortunately, that my side did not prevail. I do think that I don't believe that corporations own our county. I believe there's certainly a lot of influence, and that ballot initiatives can move forward, and they have in the past. There's been some that were passed regulating development and taxes and other things in the past. But it has to be done very carefully, very, very carefully. And to do it this year, we're running out of time, quite frankly, because the elections are coming up. You know, I believe there's a variety of paths to positive change and to protect our community. And everything from just direct action, you know, carrying signs, protesting, civil disobedience, to running for public office, putting initiatives and ballots, you know, on the ballot. And so it takes all of them, I think. And so I encourage all of you, number one, to stay involved. I think you're clearly all involved here. But pay attention to the elections. Elections are coming up. That's one reason these corporations fear local government. I served in the state senate for 8 years. It takes a majority of 25 senators and a majority of 51 House members and the governor to pass a law. County Kauai takes 4 people, and the mayor, 5 to override a veto. And so it's a lot easier in some ways to do it in communities, small communities. And you know, it just takes a handful of people to get elected to really make a difference at the local level, in my opinion. We do have elections coming up, and so I encourage you to turn out and pay attention and vote, number one. And if Paul or others want to engage a citizens initiative, I think that's a powerful tool. I really do. And my friend who works for Earth Justice, who's helping a lot, actually Paul Achitoff, we talked about this, like why do we keep fighting this whole thing? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? He said, Gary, what else are you going to do? You're just going to give them the keys? And we cannot give them the keys. And I'm not willing to give them the keys. So.
But that's a part of their game, is to exhaust the human capital.
That's right.
We're all exhausted from years of all of this, and so we have to now, it's a wonderful concept, community rights ordinance. I would love to see that happen swiftly, because we don't have a lot of time here on this island.
I agree.
And I'm going to bring up one other thing, and I've thought about this a lot, and especially in the last couple of years, we're all pretty much aware that the United States is illegally occupying Hawaii. Now, all of our begging and pleading with the corporations to stop polluting our environment and expanding on the health risks for the population, we see that they really don't care. Now, these are United States laws that they're abiding by, but we are illegally occupied by those laws. Therefore, the kingdom laws do not allow, say, pesticides or environmental destruction, because it wasn't in their consciousness back in the day. It would be wonderful for me to step back in time and say to the United States, we don't abide by your laws. Therefore, we're going to take and start cleaning up our environment and create a beautiful vision for Hawaii, and Kauai especially, as a sustainable garden island. We could do that as well. Why are we constantly fighting the big boys? Constantly. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Gary, for all of your efforts. But I really feel there's a way to move a little more swiftly. We really need to pick up the pace, and all of this governmental procedure takes a lot of time and human energy. Thanks.
I agree. I agree. Thank you for the comment, too. I think we have to remember that the population before we got here, before the Westerners got here, was in fact feeding themselves and feeding far more people that were here today, and without pesticides, without industrial agriculture. We need to always remember that, I think. Not that it wasn't hard work. Other questions, or I don't know how long we have.
All right, this is for you. Who would be your dream team on this election to work with you, so that we know what we can do to help you?
You know, the way the county council works is there's 7 members. We all run at large, so all 7 members are at large, and we all represent the entire community. And I think diversity on the council is a good thing. I don't think you need all one viewpoint necessarily. I think you get 7 votes. I'll tell you this much. Okay, I don't want to tell you who to vote for or who the good guys and bad guys are from my perspective. Okay, thank you. This is just a quick lesson. This is not a political rally, but it's important. You get 7 votes. If you go into the voting booth, it says vote for no more than 7. Okay, I encourage you to only vote for those people who you really want to get elected. Don't say, I like Gary or whoever, and then vote for 3, and then go eeny, meeny, miny, mo for the other 4. So that vote for eeny, meeny, miny, mo is the vote that beats me or beats other people. So please, just remember that. I think it's an important lesson that if, when you're voting, vote for the people who you genuinely want to get elected, and don't feel compelled to use all 7 votes. That's the only advice that I feel comfortable giving you tonight in terms of who to vote for. And be involved. There's in 3 months, in 90 days, people start voting for the primary. 90 days. And I encourage you to take ownership of your government. Don't just, go do what Gary says or anybody else. Take ownership of your civic responsibility. Meet the candidates. We live in a community, and most communities don't have this. Okay, you're fortunate. We live in a community where you can have a personal relationship with your council member or with your House or senator. You just call them up. You call me up, I'll meet with you. All 7 council members, all candidates will do, or they should do, the same thing. And so I think it's up to you to make that investment of your time and your energy to do that with your neighbors. Get a group of neighbors together and call up, all of them, Mel Raposo, Ross Kagawa, Joanne, all of us, and the new candidates, and sit down with them and ask them the hard questions. Ask them about the dairy, and find out where they're coming from, and then make your decisions based on that. I really think that's what's the fundamental thing that's wrong with our democracy, is that people are disengaged. I think, when you look at all the different systems, I think it's Winston Churchill, I forget who said that democracy is the worst form of government in the entire world except all the other forms. And it's what we have, and it can only get better with people engaged in the process. So I've talked long enough. Thank you all very much.
No, he didn't talk too long. I just came over because I want to thank him. I want you all to know that all the materials and all the science we collected, we delivered to every county council person and to our mayor in hard copy and in flash drives. Right? Gary read it, and he contacted us, and he said, you're right, this is scary. And he is the only county council person that has come out publicly in the paper, in places he goes to, and says, this is not safe for the South Shore of Kauai. And I want to thank you, Gary. And I'm sorry that others have just sort of said, well, we appreciate your concern, but we'll see how it goes. This is not something you can see how it goes. It's a toxic operation. Thanks. I didn't want to get away without saying thank you.